time, and the US government does this. So if a company, for instance, hires a company to take on a certain software project and lays off US workers, that company would not be eligible to apply for any H-1B visas. Even if the layoffs occurred 6 months after these folks entered, these people would basically have their H-1B visas revoked. So either deny the H-1B in the first place or revoke it, which is rather substantial, and that would be like an automatic trigger, and it would be a very difficult thing to sort of govern, especially when you're dealing with third-party placements, et cetera. The other major issue that you would really need to be aware of that could possibly happen is that companies could be barred from filing any H-1Bs for a period of 2 to 5 years if any of the following conditions occur. And this can happen in any court tribunal. So from my reading of it is, even if it's a local or state court that finds a company has violated prevailing wage, improperly withheld overtime or other pay, violated any employment or labor law, that company would then basically be submitted to Homeland Security, USCIS, and would be ineligible to file for H-1Bs for 2 to 5 years. So pretty drastic, because I mean you can have a rogue employee that makes allegations and a judge that may make a wrong decision, and all of a sudden now the whole company's program is compromised, and that is quite devastating. The ninth issue that I'd like to discuss is greater compliance and coordination between ICE, USCIS, and other agencies. That's already occurring. They have task forces, but they would take that up a few notches. And they would basically be very proactive in investigating companies, really for no reason at all, just pure random investigations. And if they find that there are any abuses, again, the company would be debarred from filing any H-1Bs for 2 to 5 years. And the last issue that I'd like to talk about is the elimination, more or less, of the OPT for foreign students to study in U.S. universities. Currently, it's a pretty liberal program, and there's a stopgap for our students that are caught between the various H-1B caps. This recommendation would essentially allow President-elect Trump to eliminate OPT and reduce it to a maximum of 6 months. And if an individual requests OPT, that individual has to sign a 2-year foreign residency requirement, similar to a J-1 if any of you have used J-1s, which means they'd have to leave the country for a period of 2 years before they can re-enter in any kind of work authorization, except for very few exceptions. So these are just a few of the employment-based issues. There are all sorts of issues with Social Security and other things that this plan comes forth. So there's 79 recommendations that literally President-elect Trump can put into place within 24, 48 hours upon being sworn in, and he would not need legislation on any of these points. And I think they probably have at least in terms of executive power, I think that they have the constitutional basis to do so. So, good morning, everyone.
Scary to say the least.
But I was hoping to show up here today and tell you that we're going to make immigration great again, but that's not going to be the case.
Rohit, what are your views? I mean, I'll come to the other panelists to pick up their views. But Rohit, first thoughts, scary, nightmarish?
I think I'm going to take the easier option and leave the draconian measures that Rami has kind of outlined. In terms of Brexit, if I look at Brexit, it just seems like a piece of cake compared to what Rami's just discussed. But I think the common theme seems to be that wherever the changes are being proposed or made, whether it's Brexit, whether it's UK, whether it's France, whether it's Germany, I think the two drivers or the two driving forces are, one is immigration, 2 is compliance, 3 is freedom of movement, not necessarily in that order, but clearly, and of course the desire to take back one's country. That seems to be causing a lot of problems. I think so far as Brexit is concerned, it seems to me as if the younger generation is the one that's most impacted and is seemed to be having buyer's remorse to the greatest extent. In fact, the day it happened, coincidentally, I was interviewed by Al Jazeera, and I did tell them that I think Brexit may be great for the US. Of course, I hadn't quite accounted for President-elect Trump. That may be changing things quite a bit. But Brexit clearly seems to have an impact. UK has some options, a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's what's causing a lot of heartache and heartburn, not just to individuals, but even corporations such as yours. Not quite sure what to do. Are they going to be allowed to continue to do business? Are they going to be allowed to keep their employees who are EU nationals, or even worse, the non-EU nationals? How quickly will they be asked to leave? Will the individuals become PRs of the United Kingdom and thereby protect their status in the UK and be allowed to remain indefinitely? Those are some of the concerns that they have. Of course, some people have suggested that maybe they can follow an option such as maybe Norway or Switzerland, which is not part of Schengen or not part of EU, but they've got that one zone to allow them to work. Again, of course, that's going to require the UK to commit to freedom of movement for its people and freedom of trade, and we're not quite sure how that's going to play out. Most commentators are suggesting that people obviously not panic. It's going to be at least a 2-year process before Brexit really is effected, and therefore there is time to plan. We do realize 2 years goes by fairly quickly. But I think there is some time for planning, but obviously there isn't time to be caught sleeping at the wheel.
Sure. Thanks for it. Just rolling back to the US, I'll ask Sanjeev, what's the impact you see? How are businesses reacting to the Trump election? Is it a sense of, what's it? I mean, off the cuff. I know it's too early, but what are businesses thinking?
Very early, extremely early at this point in time. It'll be interesting to see how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce reacts to this, how foreign governments react to this. Clearly the mandate, at least the perceived mandate, is that immigration has profoundly changed America and has hurt the middle class. And there are some reasonable arguments with that. But for the most part, I think in our concern here, we're mostly looking at areas that there are severe shortages that the U.S. government recognizes, which is IT, technology, engineering. And as a result, I'm really concerned about a negative impact where countries like the U.S. would lose jobs and lose companies that can easily relocate elsewhere to further their business interest. So I think there's going to be a sense of hopefully practicality, as I started this whole the discussion with, that's going to set in, because there are going to be severe consequences, I think, for many regions also too. So I also think that a lot of governors and mayors throughout the United States, and it's a very important group, are going to also say, look, you can't do this. We need the population. We need talented workers. I think the universities are going to push back and say we need foreign students. We need the researchers. So I just don't see how it could economically really happen, quite frankly. But with that said, though, things will be much tougher. Compliance will be far greater. Companies are going to have to be incredibly, incredibly careful. Forget about anything intentional. Even just mistakes or negligence in any way can be extremely harmful and very, very costly. So we will see far greater compliance, and that's fine. But at least if we have a bright line to make sure that everything's spelled out very clearly, and companies are going to have to invest a lot more into compliance and monitoring, and it's going to be a very bureaucratic process that companies are going to have to take on a lot more. I know many companies in here have been doing that for years, but I think the problem here is one bad decision in a state court somewhere could have profound impact on a business. That's the piece that I'm really kind of concerned with, because I think people or corporations will adopt to higher fees. Corporations will adopt to certain things. If it's going to be 30 days out of status, that hurts, but we'll adjust. But what we cannot adjust to very quickly would be a situation where a frivolous lawsuit is filed and the case is wrongly decided, and all of a sudden your whole program is jeopardized. So that's a very serious concern.
Sanjeev, your initial thoughts on the whole thing?
Yeah, sure. Can you able to hear me?
A little louder.
Okay, fine. Sure. You guys can hear me, right? Great. So just to add what Rami said, from the experience, almost a decade experience with US consulate, especially, he has touched upon the fraud part. So you guys know that consular section has a separate unit now that will be investigating, that almost investigates the cases which have been referred to the prevention unit. So I would emphasize on, if in case as companies you always do background verifications for your employees, but we have found when I was in there that there were credentials which were found fraud by the consulates when they investigated, and the company initially never knew. So I would strongly recommend and advise that candidates which you are sending to the consulates for the visa interview, you should make a thorough knowledge that the background verification for these employees, especially on the credentials, degree certificates, are been done, and the experience which the person will showcase across the window to the consular officer, they are not fake. Point number one. Point number two, if in case while you are doing or you're giving advice to the applicants that what kind of questions you might be asked, and in case the consular officer finds or he or she recognizes that there would be some misrepresentation, I wouldn't be saying false representation, but there are instances where we found that the experience which have been shown was not correct on the visa application. So I strongly recommend that you advise your applicants to timely confess that yes, there would be a misrepresentation, rather than sticking to the wrong facts. The reason I'm mentioning this is because there is a clause in immigration law which is called 212A6C, where it is a permanent ban. So there is a small window where if you timely retract and admit at the window to the consular officer that yes, there would be a misrepresentation, then obviously you're not banned under the ineligibility clause. So this is point number one. Point number two, earlier days, the consular officers, I wouldn't say they were not more educated, but now, they would like to dig into the kind of specialized knowledge or the H1 specialty occupation your company is demanding currently. So I would strongly recommend that instead of giving the consular officer a generic information about the specialized knowledge which you have, rather than getting into too specific, but you should be short and precise, clear and concise, with succinct articulation, that so that it helps the consular officers to adjudicate either negatively or positively, smartly. So the more you educate to the consular officer across the window would help the officer in your favor, or other way around. So that is point number two. Point number three, consular officer, that now L1 blankets are centralized, adjudicated at Chennai consulate. So even the Department of States want the adjudication to be fair. I'm not having said that, doesn't mean that the adjudications are not fair. But specialized people or the consular officers are now in Chennai consulate, who understand the computer background, the technology, the platform, the proprietary tools which you are articulating across the window. So what I'm trying to say is that the Department of State is making efforts so that the adjudication could be fair, but I would strongly recommend and advise that you at your end educate the applicants about his or her specialized knowledge. How did you acquire the specialized knowledge? What is your specialized knowledge? And more eminently is that how the knowledge is unique in nature. This is by definition, right? Everybody here in the hall knows that how it is unique in nature, how it is unusual, how it is distinguished, and how it is noteworthy. These are the four attributes apart from the soft skills, which is confidence level, articulation, communication skills, and determination. These are the softer attributes, but if you are able to articulate these four attributes strongly, the immigration trend, I would say, would be more in favor of your applicant rather than negatively affecting. So that's it.
Rami had something.
Can I?
Yeah,
Just
please.
a couple of comments. I think the points that Sanjeev mentioned are extremely important. I'd like to stress or clarify rather two things. One, he's talked about the opportunity to explain in the L1 context to the consular officer. Of course, that's important, but I think everybody in the audience would agree that the individual has an extremely limited opportunity to explain it to the consular officer. You've probably got less than 2 minutes to do it. It's hard for an individual to get into all those details. From that perspective, I think it's extremely critical for you guys to make sure that your individual applicant is articulate and is able to explain himself as best possible in the shortest time possible. I think that would be a general experience that everybody has. Second thing, Sanjeev brought up a very important point about facts and making sure that they're clear, there's no misrepresentation. In that context, it's very important to remember that a consular officer's decision cannot be overturned if there is a question of fact. Simple question of fact, consular officer is supreme. The State Department can try to persuade the consular officer to change their mind if there is a question of law, not in a question of fact. So Sanjeev's brought up a very important point. If you factually misrepresent, you potentially could be barred for the rest of your life. So that is important to remember.
Thanks. Rami, you wanted to add quickly
Yeah, no,
something?
the other aspect, and this is more on the business side, again, clearly there are shortages in a lot of the highly skilled areas, and that's not just in the U.S., that's in Canada, Europe, even India is going to experience that in the near future, they say. But I think many companies have to really now examine, and immediately, because it's not something you can do immediately, it's going to take some time. You have to put in very, very strong structures to recruit U.S. workers. You have to train U.S. workers that are unqualified, and you have to make an investment in the local areas that you're doing business. That's a must. And I know that business model did not exist in the past, but that's where most countries are dealing with and driving. Even I mentioned Canada yesterday. At the end of the day, all of these governments are trying to protect their middle class and trying to protect their young people, and they have to. I mean, just India does the same thing. So I think companies have to reinvest, and I've used this analogy before in the past here with the Japanese car makers. If you recall, in the 80s, they were forced to build their cars in America if they wanted to sell in America. Well, we're going to see that in the service end.
Sure.
And I think it's started. I think some companies are ahead in that aspect. And it's something that you have to look at long term, because you can't turn that in 6 months or even a year. So that's something that you need to immediately emphasize if you're not already doing so. The second thing I'd like to point out, and maybe I know there are a lot of lawyers in here, so I may make a statement that others may disagree with, but I think for companies that have a dependent employment-based population, you have to be very careful. You have to be careful in terms of how you interpret the law and be very conservative. Other companies may do it. Smaller companies may do it. You may have heard of this or heard of that, and you're always that notorious friend. But at the end of the day, you can't get caught on the wrong side of a liberal interpretation. So not only is it important to make sure that the facts are extremely accurate and vetted, you have to make sure that for a large company especially, you have to make sure that you take a conservative approach in this day and age, especially with what just occurred a few days ago.
Completely agree. Just reverting back to the Trump election and the campaign, there was a lot of rhetoric about the North American Free Trade Agreement and the pressures on it, etc. Rajesh, what are your thoughts? You think that'll come under pressure, that'll be there, that'll go away, and others in the panel?
I think it'll definitely be there. I think probably just to pick on what Ramesh said, I think two things. First on the OPT perspective, while it's really been suggested that they want to kind of bring in that 30-day limit, the 2-year J1 kind of limitation, I don't think that's really going to be implemented, because the first thing that's going to do is impact the basically American companies. I mean, predominantly large American companies primarily depend on US student population, because that's the scale. I think even the recent interview with Mr. Trump has clearly clarified that he's definitely wants to kind of protect the job market there, will probably pick up the bright talent. So he want to retain those bright students workforce and then kind of make use for the American market. So I don't think he's really going to implement that. That's my perspective, because the impact is going to be mainly for the large US companies, like it could be Google, Amazon, or Microsoft kinds. So the second thing is probably what he's going to do is maybe increase the minimum wage. May not be $84,000 to $90,000. If that really happens, maybe the large corporation will survive, but the medium and small scale organization would definitely have a major hit, because they play at a very low margin. I think probably there will be more consolidation in those space. I think the other third aspect that I probably want to pick up is on, missed it. Yeah, I think again on the salary range and increase in the local population. So localization ratio has to increase. I've seen a trend where large corporations already started increasing the US workforce, picking up people from the green card or the US citizens. But the medium sized and small companies are still kind of trying to use the Indian resource or looking at the global resource, the APAC population. I think even that needs to be probably considered, looked into. If they don't really increase the US population local ratio, I think that's definitely going to have a hit. And Trump has been talking about it, and I think he's going to be more serious about that.
Sanjeev, Rohit, any different
Yeah, I had a
views on
couple
this?
of comments. Just picking up on the OPT thing, just a couple of thoughts. Obviously, I don't think Trump's campaign or Trump is coming to ask me about it, but a couple of thoughts. I think if they eliminate OPT, that's going to directly impact the number of students going abroad to study in the US. Trickling down from that, again, I think it's probably going to affect many decisions made by many parents over here to send their kids to IB schools, because IB schools are really expensive as far as I can tell. If you stop sending them to IB schools because you're prepping them to go to the US, mostly if they're in IB schools, that's going to have an impact as well. I think the other impact is if OPT gets wiped out, but companies still want these people, maybe there's a resurrection of a regulation that was proposed which never got cleared, where you file an immigrant petition or a perm application even before you do the H-1. That's going to be a very interesting dilemma, I think, for companies to figure out. I don't know if my guy qualifies for an H-1. I don't know if he's going to get into the H-1B quota and get selected, but I'm starting to process his labor certification application, and I'm going to wait for 15 years before he gets a green card. So I think it's got so many ramifications that there isn't really an easy answer, and there isn't clarity for sure.
Yeah, Rami.
Rohit, since you deal with other countries for investment visas, we can always get citizenship in another country, set up a company, get them E2 visas to come in and specialize, and then, you know, maybe find another way around
Now
it.
we'll get to the
So, but no, we don't want to be too creative here, but that's a possibility.
But if the audience is not already scared enough, let's take a quick poll to see where it's at. Jay, can we have the first question about what do they see as the way ahead with President-elect Trump getting in?
You're obviously not willing to accept Trump as easily as many of us need to, Praveen.
Coming up, okay. The question is, how concerned are you about Trump's immigration policies? Extremely, somewhat, very, not at all. I'm happy to see 10% still believe this. It's not at all. That's good to see. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Clearly, close to 60% seem to be either very concerned or extremely concerned, and that's a fairly high number. And it's justified listening to what the panel had to speak about it, right?
Praveen, I have a question. The not at all,